In 1908, the year before Erwartung, Schoenberg had begun to paint. In painting, as in composition, he was largely self-taught, but he did take some lessons from a young artist, Richard Gerstl.
He came from a similar background, was at one time offered the job as music critic to a big paper, turned that down, and was a self-taught painter of quite exceptional talent, quite independent of what else was going on at the time. He met him in the Mahler concerts, where there used to be big rows, and a small sort of pro-Mahler faction used to sort of shout it out with the majority. His work at that period is very strange, something rather new, although it has certain influences of Van Gogh and Munch, for instance. There is something rather frenzied, ecstatic about it. He went with Schoenberg and his family for the summer holidays, and at that time it is believed that he taught Schoenberg the sort of rudimentaries of painting.
Schoenberg's contacts with the other arts, especially painting, were at this time far more sympathetic and fruitful than his relationship to official musical culture. He contributed to the first issue of the expressionist magazine Der Blaue Reiter and corresponded with the Russian abstract painter Wassily Kandinsky in Munich.
When Wassily Kandinsky painted pictures, the objective theme of which is hardly more than an excuse to improvise in colours and forms, and to express themselves as only a musician expressed himself until now, these are symptoms of a gradually expanding knowledge of the true nature of art. My works are disliked, wrongly or rightly. I like most of them very much.
There was a fully fledged scandal during the performance of a composition whose author has already created a public nuisance with others of his products.
The composition is not an aesthetic, but a pathological case.
But he had never gone so far as he did yesterday. Sounded like a convocation of all the neighbourhood cats.
A great artist must somehow be punished in his lifetime for the honour which he will enjoy later.
Out of respect for the composer, we will assume that he is tone-deaf, and thus musically non-compass.
And the esteemed music critic must somehow be compensated in his lifetime for the contempt with which later times will treat him.
The 5 orchestral pieces by Arnold Schoenberg form an essay in dissonance.
There is a very rancid odour of the midnight oil.
It was like a poem in Tibetan.
This is machine-made music.
Not one single soul could possibly have understood it.
Fruit of travail and long, sleepless hours.
When loud hissing continued at the end, Gustav Mahler, who was in the audience, attacked one malcontent and said, "You have no right to hiss." His unknown opponent, disdainful towards monarchs of the mind, said, "I hiss at your symphonies, too."
The endless discords, the constant succession of unnatural sounds.
He trusts the author with neither eye nor ear, but solely with his sleep-walking spirit. To that end, going to sleep is an indispensable preliminary. Going to the concert is not.
Schoenberg is the cruelest of all composers.
The music of Schoenberg's 5 orchestral pieces resembled the wailings of a tortured soul.
In Vienna, there will always be a few righteous men, but they will have to keep on terms with the unrighteous. A few decent fellows who keep their disapproval to themselves and so get on in the friendliest way with the corrupt.
Arnold Schoenberg may be either crazy as a loon, or he may be a very clever trickster who is apparently determined to cause a sensation at any cost.
My opponents. 1. Justified opposition. A. Those accustomed to understand. They know what understanding is, and know when they are not understanding something. B. The pull in the opposite direction, necessary to fight through to clarity. C. Good musicians of the old style. 2. Unjustified. A. Opposition on principle to everything new. B. Sworn in on the Bible of aesthetic principles. C. Hard of hearing. D. Compromisers. Modern, but not hypermodern. E. new trends. F, puppets. G, the successful one's running mates. I usually answer the question why I no longer write as I did at the period of Verklärte Nacht by saying, I do, but I can't help it if people don't yet recognize the fact.
Making a living was always hard, especially when his music was greeted with ferocious hostility and derision. Schoenberg survived by teaching.
Though I had to do it in order to make a living, I must confess that I was a passionate teacher, and the satisfaction of giving to beginners as much as possible of my own knowledge was probably a greater reward than the actual fee I received. This was also the reason why I accepted so many pupils who could not play, even if they had not the background to study with me. Thus I said in such a case once, after all, if they cannot digest what I give them, it would damage them less to study with me than with a poor teacher.
He was, in fact, a great teacher, and his classes produced many of the major figures in 20th century music. Alban Berg, Anton Webern, Hans Eisler, from Greece, Nikos Skalkotas, and from Spain, Roberto Gerard. His attitude to his students was dauntingly rigorous.
All pupils must make it a life's maxim that in artistic questions, compromises are ruled out, and that inflexibility is a part of talent.
The musical establishment suspected Schoenberg of training a secret army among his pupils, ready to dynamite culture. On the contrary, the classes were always grounded in a reverence for tradition.
Today's word of advice: look at a lot of music. Not just modern music, though. Like every good musician, know your Beethoven, Mozart, Wagner, Brahms, Bach, etc. Know them well. You see, that is the most important thing for you and for anyone who wants to be called a musician. How are you to understand present-day things fully unless you have grasped and digested the things they are based on?
I think one of the things one can notice about the Schoenberg of these years is the treatment of the human voice, and particularly the treatment of the female human voice. In Erwartung, you have all the resources of a Wagnerian opera soprano with very difficult intervals and an extended range. And later in Perrault Lunaire, you find completely new ways of using the voice. In the song Herzgewächse, with its strange tinkling accompaniment for celesta and harp and harmonium, you find yet a further extension. I think one can safely say this is the widest range that the voice has ever been written for, because it goes from a very high F in alt, which is a sort of Mozart coloratura note, to very low notes, which are hollow in the soprano voice. The poem itself, by Maurice Maeterlinck, is about a sick lily which raises its translucent crystal-like petals to the sky.
The words are often an occasion, an excuse, a stimulus. What really draws me to them is my musical need. Certain texts are, in fact, often very well suited, if I may put it in this way, to send the music on its adventures. I was driven onward by the need for brevity, precision, definition, and clarity. I had the sense that I was now saying it better, more clearly, more unambiguously, more personally.
(1911). Hard times for Schoenberg in Vienna. Gustav Mahler died on the 18th of May. It was a blow to all the radical artists, for whom Mahler had been a powerful model and a sympathetic friend. After attending the funeral, Schoenberg wrote this elegiac little piano piece.
For the present, I could not live in Vienna. I have not yet got over the things done to me there. I am not yet reconciled.
By the September of 1911, Schoenberg's financial situation was disastrous. He left for Berlin to teach at the Stern Conservatoire. In the early years of the century, Berlin had been the center of experimental cabaret. Schoenberg's next major work was to reflect this. Pierrot Lunaire remains probably his most famous composition.
And for this work, Schoenberg invented something completely new, namely a sort of mixture between heightened speech and song, so-called Sprechgesang. This has quite a history because it's a peculiar thing. Earlier in the century, Schoenberg cooperated in a sort of cabaret movement which was started by a German intellectual called Ernst von Wolzogen, who wanted to start up in Berlin the tradition of the kind of intellectual nightclub which was prevalent in Paris and in the art of the diseurs. And this was called Überbrettel. It didn't last long, but we do know that Schoenberg contributed a number of original satirical songs for voice and a few instruments to it.
As early as 1901, I wrote a vocal piece. It was performed once, arousing the greatest lack of reaction in Wolzogen's Buntes Theater, 1902, whose accompaniment, consisting of piano, piccolo, trumpet, and side drum, may well have been the first example of a chamber orchestra and a predecessor of the jazz band.
What is extraordinary about Pierrot Lunaire is the musical invention, because it is amazing what is going on behind the text. But in form, a speaker, semi-singer, with a tiny little instrumental group, perhaps of popular Viennese origin, we certainly have a work which has had the greatest possible influence on the greatest number of composers.
Einen weißen Fleck des hellen Mondes auf dem Rücken seines schwarzen Rockes. So spaziert Pierrot im lauen Abend, auszusuchen sucht Abenteuer. Plötzlich stört ihn was an seinem Anzug. Besieht sich rings und findet richtig einen weißen Fleck des hellen Mondes auf dem Rücken seines schwarzen Rockes. Warte, denkt das ist so ein Gipsfleck. Wischt und wischt, doch bringt den nicht herunter. Und so geht der Gips geschwollen weiter. Reibt und reibt, bis alle Wörter gehen. Einen weißen Fleck des Mondes.
A musical, or rather unmusical ensemble, discoursed the most ear-splitting combinations of tones that ever desecrated the walls of a Berlin music hall.
The usual critical reaction of the time.
It is superfluous to describe the attitude of these people.
But Piero Lunaire had an enormous impact on all kinds of composers. Luigi Della Piccola went to a performance one April the 1st, some years later.
The press defined this Florentine performance worthy of April 1st. Two people this night was certainly deeply impressed by this performance. I will begin with the by far less important, which is myself. The other was Giacomo Puccini. He was very sick, but he did this trip from Viareggio to Florence just in order to hear this word. Because Puccini was very interested in a very new experiment.
It was the commercial composers who respected Schoenberg, not the academics. Hans Eisler told his son of Schoenberg's contact with, of all people, Franz Lehár.
He instrumentated something for Lehár, one of the operators, and Lehár was an extremely successful and even richer composer, always had a sort of feeling of bad conscience towards Schoenberg, and at one time made over the royalties of a certain work to benefit Schoenberg. So Schoenberg was able to sort of have a little income on very much on the quiet